Good morning, everyone. I'm Carla. I'm the marketing manager here at FuseForward. And while we're waiting to get started, I'd like to welcome you to the second episode of our webinar series, Remote Control. So this series is designed to take a quick deep dive into common challenges IT professionals are facing, particularly now as where everyone is moving to deliver online services. So we're all pressed for time these days. So the key is that we're going to keep these sessions short and quick, but we are still making time for questions. So if you have questions during the session, just drop them in the Q&A panel below. And if possible, we'll address them in the session, but if not, we will circle back to them at the end. So today we have Mark Damm, our founder and CTO, on the call. Mark is a skilled systems architect with over 30 years experience implementing complex IT systems for enterprise and public sector. Today, he is going to be talking about remote access for legacy and on-premise applications. So I'm going to hand over to him now and we can get started. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I usually work around the world, so it's quite interesting on this global world that we have the opportunity to talk to many different people on many different time zones. Today we're going to talk a little bit about remote access for legacy and on-premise applications. So what does that mean? I have a number of people I've been chatting with, my wife being one of them, who has a challenge of being able to work from home where she can't actually access all of the legacy systems like payroll and has to go on site in the healthcare world in order to process payroll systems. I was listening to this and I'm like, well, you want to know? We can fix that. And we already have ways that we're already doing that today. And what are all the different approaches that we can do? So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a couple of the different approaches, share with you what people have traditionally done today. How do we go through and still make use of new cloud technology if possible, as well as how do we go and create a resilient operation so that we can still manage remote access to not only your new emerging SaaS applications, but also the legacy remote and on-premise applications that are out there. So let's move on a little bit. As we go through, if you've got any questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll be able to and answer them as we go along. So what kind of things do we think about that we may want to be going through and managing on-prem? So I shared HR payroll. You know, in public sector agencies, many of the payroll systems themselves and the HR systems are old legacy systems. Some of them exist on mainframes, if you remember what those things are. And we run into the challenge of how do we go through and still access those when we may not, and access them securely when they're containing confidential information, and yet we're now in this work from home model and we want to be able to go through and access them. What about other ones? Operations. I always think of real-time systems. So I grew up working with utility companies, and one of the key challenges we run in there is how do we go through and manage all the water, wastewater, electric, and power grids that we have, and how do we control them remotely? How can I go into and turn on the heat, turn off the heat with my HVACs? How do I go through and monitor my energy consumption? How do I make sure that my water is flowing and that the water treatment plants are working if I can't necessarily go on premise all the time? All right, what about financials? We run still a lot of SAP, PeopleSoft, and other types of applications. And while some of them have web-based front ends, finance departments are usually pretty scared about going through and exposing them through just a direct connection or a web-based portal. They want to lock all of that down. All right, what about in healthcare? Well, healthcare, what if I'm looking at trying to go through and monitor patient records, or if I want access to my patient information? I'm a doctor now working from home, meeting with patients, but I need access to the records that are sitting in the doctor's office, and I want to be able to go through and access them from home, but I need to do it securely. And by the way, the network traffic is not allowed to go through any sort of other jurisdictions other than within country. What if I'm a student and I'm trying to go through and get access to my classrooms? But this time I'm actually working on and doing a project where I need to do design work, and I need an old legacy or a thick client, or what we call a thick client application, where the software actually works on my desktop, but all the data resides in a remote database somewhere. All right, what about if I'm an engineer? Engineers work with computer-aided design systems. They work with other types of very PC or desktop intensive applications. One of the interesting things I always think of from an engineering perspective is how to compare it to the movie editors. And I'm not sure how many people are aware, but most movie editors that are out of Hollywood use virtual desktops and other techniques, and they actually edit the movies while sitting in California, in Los Angeles, but they're actually running and monitoring all of the editing and doing it in sites wherever the film is being filmed. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges in all of this. The connectivity is a big issue. So when we're trying to get remote access right now to or to our on-premise applications, the technologies that we've used are PC intensive applications. So they might have been written in an application called .NET or something from Microsoft. They might have a application that actually gets installed on the desktop in order to access it. And what we're now looking at is they may store some data and need a hard drive to drop things. So those are your old legacy on-premise desktop applications. We also have some of those legacy client server apps. While they may be browser-based, we still don't want to expose them via the internet, because then anybody could potentially get into them or try to hack them in using a brute force approach. And then they would get into your network and be able to go through and create all kinds of security challenges. Or we actually heard stories over the last month where even organizations like Cisco have run out of VPN capacity for their actual workforce. When they have 100,000 staff and they're all now forced to work from home, they have to have enough VPN capacity itself, and VPN basically a virtual private network capacity, so that anybody with a PC links in as through a VPN connection and then access the systems on premise that way. So those are all the challenges. And what we start running into is organizations that are building out their own network capacity and using VPNs with client desktops. We always run into the challenges of, is the device being used by the organization or by the individual working from home? Is it secure, locked down, and does it have virus protection on it? So not only do we have connectivity challenges, we also have security challenges. So that kind of drives us in. You know, one of the biggest threats that we see right now with organizations and looking at the attack surface for cybersecurity is email. It's not necessarily, the two main ones right now that are causing challenges inside organizations are not hackers getting in and getting into the system, but email systems where somebody clicks on an attachment and it opens up a security breach. Or an email that has got a social engineering requirement to it, where it's asking somebody for credentials and they respond back with credentials. Those are ways that hackers get into your environment where they don't necessarily need to go through and challenge or break a firewall. You're actually giving them credentials to get in, or you're giving them the ability to install software inside the shop. So when we're working from home, we're dealing with remote applications, we have on these devices that everybody has that they're using from home, a laptop computer or a home desktop. We don't know what other email clients are on there because it might be their own personal device. They might be using a phone, which may not have virus protection on it. How do we go through and ensure that somebody from home where they've left their computer open is not necessarily, it's actually them at the end of the line, and it's not their kids, or it's not their husband or wife if they're sitting up and looking at their screen and coming up to their laptop. My kids actually use my laptop sometimes, but I have separate laptops that I share with the kids, and the one I'm on right now is me only, and I actually lock it down, and every time I walk away, I put caps lock and I basically lock the machine. So we have to go through and think about things of verifying identities. You know, the other things we got to look at, how do we authorize them when they're going and trying to access an application that they are authorized to get there? So while we might be able to allow an organization or an individual to get in on the VPN, do we know that they're authenticated to our Active Directory environment so they have to log into the network as well? How do we authorize them to make sure that they're accessing only the applications they have? How do we make sure that the network connectivity that they're linking through doesn't have somebody else with a man in the middle monitoring all the traffic going through the network? And then, is the application configured properly so that it can handle remote access? Or is there a whole bunch of actual other challenges that we need to do in order to reconfigure the applications to allow remote access? So a lot of different things that you look at, challenges both on the connectivity side, on the security side. So we've kind of been working through this, and we actually work with a number of government agencies and operations centers. And what we do is we've always been saying, well, how can we go through and use cloud computing, new network infrastructure, and virtual desktops to facilitate providing a secure environment where you can still go through and access your on-premise applications, but use the capabilities of the cloud to help do that. So here's some of the options. A VPN landing zone. So traditionally, many organizations go and create their own. Cisco has it, and then what they did is they start going through and creating a VPN landing zone for their own internal staff. Then they expand it out and say, you know, why don't we go and give VPNs to other people? A lot of people have probably heard about VPNs for private use, where we want to go through and run Netflix from Europe, but we live in Canada. Well, we can go through and link into a personal VPN, connect into Europe, and then make ourselves look like we're in Europe to access Netflix in Europe. Well, VPNs that way still don't protect your on-premise environment because they're not in front of your on-premise environment. They're only going through, and all they're creating is masking where you are from home and where you're actually accessing the internet. So a VPN landing zone is an environment that's in front of your corporate networks, your corporate applications that you use to basically link into the systems behind it. So that's a VPN. How do you access a VPN? On your desktop, you have a VPN client installed, and that VPN client sets up the security and you link into that landing zone. Another approach that we run into is virtual desktops. What's a virtual desktop? Virtual desktop is not the actual PC that you're using, but it creates a virtual session on another server sitting in a data center that is your desktop. It's a container. It is a secure container though, because what it has on it is only the software that you need to use in order to access, to basically run that desktop. So remote desktop services is what we call it. Now, two ways of doing that. There's usually a piece of software that installs on your desktop to do that. And there's also usually a connection that you need to use. So we always look at virtual desktops as part of the equations and things that we want to do. And what we're starting to see more and more is cloud-based VPN landing zones. So what are these? Well, cloud-based landing zone is basically an area deployed in AWS, Amazon Web Services, for example, that would basically have a whole bunch of VPN servers, firewalls that support VPN. And what we would then do is take that landing zone and connect the corporate network to that. I have a diagram to show that in a minute to explain how this all works. But what a VPN landing zone is it can basically be accessed and you can deploy it in multiple regions throughout the world. And then what happens is by using that, we're not subject to a capacity requirement of an on-premise VPN. We're able to go through and burst up and scale as required in that landing zone. So it creates a distributed network and a distributed support for that. Now, the key thing I look at is there's always a bunch of different use cases that we want to look at. For example, who would use a virtual desktop versus who would want to go through and use a cloud-based VPN? Or is there a case where you want to use both? So let's look at a little bit of an example of how some of that comes into bear. I like my hand-driven. I hope you all like my my notes here and my drawings. I try to keep this a little bit more low scale and not as prettied up, and I keep drawing more and more diagrams as we go, and I can keep. I love doing the diagrams to help out with everybody. But let's try and understand how this works. So I've got somebody working from home or in a mobile device. What do all those people have access to? They have access to the internet. Now, having access to the internet doesn't necessarily mean I have access to my SaaS applications or my on-premise applications. So for example, if you've set up your SaaS applications to have single sign-on and they have to authenticate through your corporate credentials, you can't get access to those necessarily unless it's all been configured properly to access those credentials and it has a linkage into that system. Your on-premise applications may require a bunch of software to be installed on a desktop. Well, I can install it on a PC I have at home, but I still may not have the network connectivity until I'm connected into the client VPN to actually get into my systems. So that's an approach. People are using the first approach and the top approach here, where what they're doing is they may have a home PC, they set up a VPN client on it, the company sets up a client VPN access, and then what they're doing is they're going through and accessing the on-premise applications. So that's one approach. Some of the challenges on this is the client VPN, as we've been seeing, is many of our clients are running into limited capacity, and they're basically, we have doctors' offices right now that we know about that can only have a third of their staff working because they don't have enough VPN connections to allow their whole team to work. So they're hitting capacity requirements on the client VPN access. So I'm like, okay, well, how can we go through and solve that? Well, the way to do that is to create what we have down on the bottom there, a cloud VPN zone. So the cloud VPN zone augments or enriches that. And what happens is we can then basically have the user from home linking into a cloud VPN, and we concentrate them. So we can have an unlimited number of VPN connections in the cloud VPN zone. And the cloud VPN then is used with a direct connection to the on-premise applications. Okay? So what happens is that client then, and all of them, you can continue to expand the capacity of the VPN zone by going through and allowing them access into the on-premise applications. But that doesn't solve the problem of your old legacy apps. So for the legacy applications, one of the key challenges we find is that you have to install something on a desktop. Well, how do we go through and do that? So that's where virtual desktops come into play. And cloud virtual desktops are some of the best. So what we do is we look at and say, well, what we can do is you have an environment where on your laptop, on your desktop or laptop at home, you have an application or a browser. And through the browser, you type in and say, okay, browser, and here is my location, and you can launch a virtual desktop within a browser. What's on that virtual desktop now is all of the application software that you need in order to run your on-premise applications. So it could be the front end and all of those. And what we do is on these virtual desktops, we also don't allow email clients. So if we don't put email on them, that means that we can't accidentally click on an attachment and infect the desktop, which would then infect the on-premise applications. It's remote and isolated from the PCs at home. So you can still use your email on your PC, but when you're in your virtual desktop, you're in an isolated environment and you're not actually talking to anything on your desktop at home. You're using a virtual desktop. That virtual desktop can have just what the company needs and wants to give their staff to do that. These virtual desktops, by the way, are also on demand. They're not always on. You only pay for the time in which the desktop is actually active, and you can share an unlimited amount of capacity to spin up or spin down more desktops. Now, one key thing I always look at, and we have clients doing this today that are running secure operations centers for engineering, for utility companies. So what do? Well, if I've got something where I have an operator that needs to access my systems in like my water treatment plant, my energy grid, we link two things together. We create a virtual desktop coupled with the virtual desktop using a cloud VPN to actually go through and access the security administration rights within servers and systems. Provides two levels of authentication and creates an additional layer of security between the virtual desktop, which is accessible via the web, plus you go through with the virtual desktop that creates the VPN session, and you have to have credentials to get into the VPN, and then you're in as a privileged user into the environments. The beauty with all of this approach is this creates multiple layers of security for an organization, for the administrative staff. Through all of these, you'll see a couple of areas where there's authentications, and those authentications are usually protected with multi-factor authentication. So we're doing identity verification and authentication at the same time. And depending upon the security posture, you can even use biometrics and camera-based approaches like your iPhones in order to go through and authenticate and make sure that that person is really the person that needs to be accessing. So you got to look at their face, okay? And then the computer can go through and look at their face. So I've given you a little bit about remote access. In summary, when you're looking at and you're trying to think about what can I do with an on-premise application, how do I give access to it? Everybody thinks that we need to open up our networks to the world in order to go through and allow that to happen. No, you don't. Best way to do it, protect your on-premise applications. Even if your on-premise applications are in a cloud, in AWS, Azure, or a combination of many, you can still protect them by putting in using cloud virtual desktops and cloud VPN zones in order to go through and protect all of your applications. Gives you an additional layer of security, and by using these two capabilities, you're able to scale and you're able to go and give remote delivery capabilities so that even if your applications are running in, say, Virginia or Oregon in AWS or in Montreal, you can still run your desktops a little bit more within country, and then you know that you're basically improving the speed of access for your individual users. I want to leave it there, see if there's any questions from anybody right now related to this.
All right, we have one question here, Mark. How does single sign-on work when accessing legacy applications on-premise?
So single sign-on is two areas. When I look at single sign-on, there's always an area, some of the applications themselves are not going to, your on-premise applications have to support single sign-on, or they have to support Active Directory type of a directory integration. So if your on-premise application is already linked into your directory and you're logging into your network, once you're logged into your network, you are now able to go through and access those applications as if you were sitting in your corporate network. If your corporate network and you're already not configured with that, then of course you're not going to be able to do that. And that's one of the challenges that you run into. But typically you're able to go through, and if it is already enabled with and linking into your directory and your corporation is already using your network credentials to access an app, then going through this authentication step is the step where you're actually logging into the network itself, and that's then giving you permissions to get into your on-premise applications. Okay.
Great. And then the second question here, where are the cloud VPN zones located?
So cloud VPN zones can be located in any, we typically deploy them, like for FuseForward, we actually maintain a set of cloud VPN zones in countries, so in AWS regions and hubs. So we have them in Montreal as an example. We have them in Virginia, we have them in Oregon, we have them in Ireland and Dublin, we have them in Frankfurt, we have them in London. All of those are cloud VPN zones that scale up as required and more demands come in. You can typically deploy these, and you're usually leveraging a cloud provider. In our case, we're using AWS. So it's wherever cloud providers are providing their on-ramps and basically allowing you to go and deploy cloud infrastructure. And that's where you can then deploy the appropriate infrastructure to maintain a VPN zone.
I actually think that's it for questions right now. Unless anyone else has any?
No.
No? Okay.
So I'm going to go through and hand it over a little bit and share with you one more screen here, a couple more things here, and then I'll hand it over to Carla in a minute. In fact, Carla, maybe you can talk to a little bit of this one right here, and I can jump to the last slide as well. I want to thank you for listening to me. Hopefully this has been informative, and we're continuing to go through, and the rest of my team and myself will continue to give you some additional remote desktop, some additional information on secure remote desktops, and we have remote control and more services coming along. Carla, back to you, and maybe you can share some of the last two slides here.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Mark. So for those that are listening, right now we have a limited time offer. It's running until June 30. And basically we are offering a secure remote desktop service. Edric's going to post the link to that in the chat channel now. But it will include 50 free users for Amazon Workspaces. So the solution is built on Amazon Workspaces. And that's actually can be quite a potential saving. Designed to help people through, this challenging time. We know a lot of businesses are rushing to deliver online services. So that's that offer. And if you just want to, can you flick that? Yes, thanks, Mark. We also have more content coming up. So Coming up on next Thursday, 30th of April, we have Cloud and High Performance Compute. So this is a webinar that, let me just pull up the details. We're participating in it with CanShield, AMPD Technologies, and Cancer Computer. So I won't go into the details of all of those companies, but it looks like it's going to be really interesting. And all four of us will be presenting on the latest industry trends and use cases related to high performance computing. And following that, the week after, we have our next remote control session, which is about VPN connections. So Mark, you might be able to jump in here, but I know that there's been a lot of issues related to companies running out of VPN connections. So the topic is how to establish a VPN landing zone to improve connectivity, bandwidth, and protect your data. So expanding a little bit on what we spoke about today.
So what this would be, as I'm anticipating that we're going to have one of our solution architects going through and helping to walk through the steps of how to set up a VPN landing zone.
Yep, excellent. And Edric has posted the links to the webinar, to the limited time offer, and if you'd like to sign up for remote control, he will also post a link to our subscription in a moment. And if you don't get those, I'll be sending these out in email afterwards, along with the recording from today. So if there's no further questions, thank you for listening. If you're interested in more, subscribe to our series. We'll have the link coming up soon. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, reach out to us on Twitter, or yeah, drop us an email. I'd love to hear from you, and topic suggestions as well. Great, so I think if that's everything this morning, we'll end this meeting. We've wrapped up right on time, so thanks.
Thanks very much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.